tell, we've been doing this for a number of years, and the activity involves inviting either one of our own faculty members from the English department or a member we call a friend of the English department. We've had various English professors from area colleges present on these evenings in the fall. And so we're delighted to have Dr. Beach this year. He has read on different occasions, but we've switched it up a little bit. I'm following what some of you may be aware of. The 92nd Street Y offers readings of this nature throughout the year, and if you ever have an opportunity to go down to the 92nd Street Y, I encourage you to do so. But we're going to use the format of both interviewing Dr. Beach and also giving him the opportunity to read some of his poetry to us this evening. And my hope is that you have an opportunity to not only hear the poetry, and of course you have, if you picked up a copy of the program, you'll have copies of many of the poems that he will be reading this evening. And that will give you an opportunity. I always like when I go to a poetry reading to be able to actually see the poem rather than only hear it, although I enjoy hearing it. Seems like that extra benefit of being able to see it on the page. And sometimes the way that it's expressed on the page, of course, has a part of the meaning resident in it. And so you can follow along as we go. And we may not have Dr. Beach may not read all of them, or he may read some others that are not in the booklet, but each gives you an opportunity to become acquainted with some of his works. And he's been gracious enough to give us a variety of his works to give sort of a picture of his life as a poet. He didn't start yesterday. I won't go into the details, but he's certainly been working on creative writing of various types, and even photography, as you see in the booklet as well. We'll talk a little bit about that. When we conclude our evening, I'll give you an opportunity. If I've left out a question that you think should have been asked, I will certainly encourage you to raise that question, and Dr. Beach can respond as he sees fit. I'd like to open the evening with something a little bit different from what you have in your program as far as an introduction to Dr. Beach. I'd actually like to read a piece by someone that we both know. That is to say, we're both Houghton College graduates, and Dr. Jack Lex was a professor there. Now, Dr. Beach had a number of courses with Professor Lex. I did not have any classes, but I had the privilege of teaching with him for 1 year when I taught at Houghton way back in the early part of my career. And he put out a book entitled Grace is Where I Live, The Landscape of Faith and Writing. And the reason I'm going to read this is I believe that Dr. Beach embodies the third example, of the third way that people use language. And so allow me to read just this portion, again, as an introduction to Dr. Beach, and then we'll get underway with our questions. So Jack Lex writes, language and reality are inextricably bound, so bound that some critics argue that reality is linguistic. I think common sense refutes them. The world is larger and more complex than my linguistic structure. But common sense also grants some truth to their position. My expressible knowledge of that world is limited by my language, not limited by my facility with language, but by language itself. And then he says, given this, I can imagine 3 strategies for how I use my words. 1, I can choose silence, refuse to speak, and try to apprehend the world and God in wordless perfection. This is the way of the mystic and of my late dog, Poon, a blue tick hound, who while he lived never spoke a word, but seemed to know all things. 2, I can choose to accept the language and the givens of my culture group as final, be molded by them into the likeness of every other member of the group, and speak cliches and platitudes. 3rd, I can consciously choose the creative responsibility of language. And he says, consider the creation narrative in Genesis. For 6 days God labored, speaking the world into being. He did not labor as an engineer, he labored as a poet. Then he rested, or as a wise man pointed out, he created rest. After resting, he assigned Adam the task of naming the creation. By assigning Adam this task, God involved him in the completion of the creation. He involved him in it in such a manner that he could know nothing apart from his linguistic involvement with it, his relation to it. Adam's reality is relational, discovered new every day, evolving. It is never complete, for it exists in the interaction of the physical world and language. It is intentionally open. This does not, however, mean that my language has no connection with what has been said before. My language is traditional. It is alive, rooted, and growing. And let me just repeat that line. Third, he says, I can consciously choose the creative responsibility of language. And I believe that is a good description of our own Dr. Beach. And so at this point, I'm going to turn to him and ask him a number of questions, and we'll see how this goes. All right, so anyone who's visited your office knows that you enjoy reading, and I think it's also fair to say that you enjoy collecting books. I have never visited his home, but if anything tells me,
it's much worse.
It is multiplied manifold. Who are some of your favorite poets, and how have they influenced you, influenced your themes and styles?
I could talk hours upon my favorite poets. I included just a couple in the booklet because to kind of represent different aspects. Much of my reading of poetry before really when I was in grad school and even more recently was the classics, especially the British literature, everything from Cadman's Hymn all the way in through the late 1800s. And of course T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound and a few others. It wasn't until the last 5 to 10 years where I've read much more contemporary poetry, and especially when I was teaching a couple of years ago the modern poetry class, where I had to spend a summer basically learning poets and poems that many of them I had heard names, but I hadn't actually read. And so I spent a lot of time. In fact, I have the front bedroom in my house, one whole set of bookshelves there is just all the poetry, because I put all the books of poetry in one place so I could prepare that summer. And so right now that's pretty much it's spilling out onto the bed and onto the floor, but that's where I keep a lot of the poetry. Some of the examples I gave in the booklet, one of them is John Donne. When I was in college, I read John Donne, and I knew I loved him the minute I read him in Renaissance Lit class. One of the few Renaissance Lit poets that spoke to me as I think it was a sophomore. I didn't know why I loved him, I just knew I loved him. It wasn't until I had a 17th century poetry class in grad school with Dr. Robert Ray, who basically painstakingly went through a whole bunch of John Donne poems that I understood why I loved John Donne. His radical imagery, for instance, his Holy Sonnet 14, which is one of my favorite sonnets of all time, one of my favorite short lyrics of all time, because it's a poem that's expressing, he's basically a prayer to God, but it is not a safe and tame and comfortable prayer to God. The language he uses is language that most of us wouldn't think of using when we talk about God or talk to God. Batter my heart, three-personed God, for you as yet but knock, breathe, shine, and seek to mend. That I may rise and stand, overthrow me, and bend your force to break, blow, burn, and make me new. I, like a usurped town to another do, labor to admit you, but oh, to no end. Reason your viceroy me should defend, but is captive and proves weak or untrue. Yet dearly I love you and would be loved fain, but am betrothed unto your enemy. Divorce me, untie, or break that knot again. Take me to you, imprison me, for I, except you enthrall me, shall never be free, nor ever chase, except you ravish me. The idea of being, unless we are enslaved by God, we will never truly be free. Echoes, of course, some things that the Apostle Paul says. But it's the powerful imagery, the unexpected imagery. And that's part of what the metaphysical poets like John Donne are trying to do. They're trying to shake us up. They're trying to make comparisons we would never think of. Now, in my own poetry, I generally don't do that kind of as radically because it's easier, I think, not to be as radical and so on. And the second poet I included here, Anne Riddler, I thought of a whole bunch of different 20th century poets I could include. from American or British lit, and I had to think of Anne Ridler, who was influenced by Charles Williams. She started her career as the secretary to T.S. Eliot at Faber and Faber. In fact, Eliot and Williams both finally convinced her to try to publish her poems, and her first book came out in 1939, and she was publishing all the way through to her death in 2001. And in 1998, when I was in England, I came across her collected poems. And I read through them. I'd read some of her poems here and there, but I'd never read all the way through. And while she would be considered a minor poet compared to a lot of the big names of the century, what struck me was that she took all these traditional forms, including line verse, including the Spenserian stanza, including the sonnet and the villanelle, like this poem, and she tried to make them fresh and new and alive in 20th century language. Not necessarily radical, not necessarily shocking. This poem is about, she's speaking to her husband, Vivian Ridler, who was a publisher. He was, and they were married from 1938 or so until she died in 2001, and he died a couple years later. And she writes a lot about marriage, writes a lot about motherhood. She wrote a bunch of poems for each of her children, and she writes a lot about things that maybe aren't trendy or cool, but are things that are lasting. And that's one of the things that appeals to me. Another 20th century poet similar to her in some ways is John Heath Stubbs, also influenced by Charles Williams, and someone I also admire, but I had to choose one poet, so I chose Anne Ridler. And this is the villanelle. The villanelle, for those of you who don't know, the villanelle, the first line is repeated at the end of the second stanza, the end of the fourth stanza, and again in the last stanza. And the third line is repeated at the end of the third stanza, and the end of the fifth stanza, and then the last line. And it's a very complicated pattern. And I wrote a couple villanelles when I was teaching the advanced poetry workshop, because I said, if I'm making my students write this, I'm going to attempt to write it too. So villanelle for the middle of the way. When we first love, his eyes reflect our own. When mirrors change to windows we can see. Seeing, we know how much is still unknown. Was it a trite reflection? What is shown when we gaze deep begins the mystery. When we first love, his eyes reflect our own. Neither of us could cast the first stone, and to forgive is tender. Now, thought we, seeing we know. How much was still unknown we later learnt. But why forgiveness groaned, as Blake discovered, act for eternity, though in first love his eyes reflect our own. What was the crime for which you would atone, or could be crime now between you and me, seeing how we know how much is still unknown? I know you now by heart, not eyes alone. Dearer the dry than even the green tree. When we first love, his eyes reflect our own. Seeing, we know how much is still unknown. And I like the idea that when they first love, they see each other, they see themselves and so on, and there's that common ground, but it's even better, she's suggesting, the further they go. And there aren't that many love poems that kind of do that, I don't think. Some maybe, but. And the third poem I included here was, I decided to choose a poet from outside the English language tradition, because I've read a lot of world poets in translation. And one of the poet groups that I've been really influenced by, I've read a lot of translated poetry in, are Albanian poets. And this is, Ivan Vinca is an Albanian poet from Macedonia. So he was a minority within a country, and he grew up in the first 4 decades or so of his life, the country was Yugoslavia, not Macedonia, and it was a communist country. So there's some echoes here of, I think in the poem, of being willing to speak out in situations where you're not going to necessarily want to be heard. Because in the communist world, they wanted poets to toe the party line and speak, write socialist realism and all of that. But poets tend, especially the good ones, are not going to toe a party line, and they're going to speak their mind, even if it means, in the case of some Albanian language poets, spending much of their life in jail, labor camps, and so on. And I like this poem because, not just because of the simplistic, very brief stanzas. I encountered this similar kind of pattern in Arabic poetry, which I found fascinating because a lot of my early mentors in poetry were all these long stanzas, and here, these very short stanzas, brief and to the point. And I like the idea of all of these stanzas begin with an infinitive, a verb that's to do something, but it's the infinitive form, so it's kind of, there's that, almost that endless nature to it. Becoming a poet. To be an oasis in the wilderness, not to forget there are many who thirst in this world. To be a lantern in the darkness, not to forget there are many blind in this world. To be a ship in the waves, not to forget the forgotten masses are waiting on the banks. To say pig to the pig and Socrates to Socrates and drink your part of the poison. To write an open letter to the Lord and list all your sins. To dig your own grave on the highest mountain peak and turn into a lightning rod. In the first three stanzas, images of hope. The fourth one, speaking truth to the world around you and recognizing that you are part of that world, drinking your part of the poison. The humility and honesty to write an open letter to the Lord and list all your sins. That takes a lot of humility and honesty, I think. And then to kind of bear or attract the power of the universe, maybe the power of God. Maybe, a lightning rod gets struck by lightning, but it gets struck by lightning so that the house or the building around it isn't struck by lightning. And in some ways, a poet may perhaps be that kind of thing.
Thinking about your earliest poetry, I know most poets would rather not remember those days, so I appreciate your willingness to share some early work.
Oh, trust me, there were some that made me...
So my question is, when you look at an early poem and you recall what you were thinking about, what you were attempting to do, if you could talk a little bit about, what did you have in mind, and then maybe speak about why the poem is less satisfactory to you now, not simply because it's in the past, but what has changed in a sense about your aesthetic, or well, you can talk about what's changed.
Well, part of the difficulty was I came to writing poetry gradually and without a lot of focus, because when I started writing, and I started writing 50 years ago, when I was 5 years old, I started writing stories. And all the way through high school, I wrote poems if I was forced to by an English teacher. And somewhere in my files, I have a really sarcastic little sonnet that I had to write when we were doing sonnets in 9th grade, in which I basically told the teacher to go sit on it, which was a common expression at the time. And of course, he was not happy about it. The class liked it, but he didn't give me Well, it was like, and it was one of those things that I wrote it because I had to write a sonnet, but I didn't really want to write a poem. I'd rather write a story. The irony is, in the last decade, I've written much more poetry than I've written stories. In fact, I haven't begun and finished a story in the last 7 years. And it's just because I've been much more motivated to write poetry. But when I started writing poems, a lot of it was, I was trying to kind of get a sense of feeling, but I didn't really know what I was wanting to do. Because a lot of my early poems, they were either kind of random images thrown together, like the first one, or they were attempts at saying something that I didn't know really how to say yet. And so the one poem I was looking at was it was trying to describe a mountain with a waterfall, and the form doesn't work, and the imagery is all kind of, I was trying to make the mountain look like a person or something, and I was looking at it going, that's not going to go in this booklet, because it was it got published in the school literary magazine, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything. Writing majors kind of had to be included, I think. And this first one here was actually something I jotted down because I was in a class we were doing graphic printing and design. Our writing professor had this course, and I needed something and I didn't have anything that would really fit, so I just made up something and set the type and all of that. And it was probably better than most of what I was actually seriously writing in college. It happened to me again about 10 years later. I was writing a poem. Well, I was putting together a collection of poems, and I had one blank page, and I was going to print it the next day, and I didn't want to take time, and I was like, I don't have an extra poem. So I sat there, it was raining outside, I just wrote this random poem about rain and how I was missing somebody, and everybody who read that collection thought it was the best poem. So I'm like you just sometimes never know. The poem that fit in that empty space happened to be the one. So anyway, this one, I listened recently, I've been listening to some waltzes, and this was influenced by the Blue Danube by Johann Strauss. And so I just picture people dancing a waltz. The poem has no waltz rhythm in it, which is probably part of the difficulty. But the satin white embrace and satin white, those are gloved hands, holding gloved hands, and no real human contact. And so anyway, by the Danube. Swirling rhythms, 3/4, celestial pattern, whisper of skirts on polished wood, lords all black moving, gracefully among rippling, surging islands of lace. Venus gliding in capable hands, satin white embraced in satin white, stirring the heat of summer evening into the blaze of a fallen sun. I love the motion, the symmetry of fabric. As one in the corner seat, I never take the floor. Don't stop the trance, darling, this is our last dance. Don't stop the trance, darling. 3/4 time among mortal stars. And the reason why I was kind of doing the italicized part a little differently, that was a modification and echoing of the part of U2's Two Hearts Beat as One, which goes, don't stop the dance, darling, this is our last chance. And it was one of those things, I listen to a lot of music, and sometimes I listen to while I'm writing poetry, and this is one of the few cases where it actually showed up, almost word for word, in the poem. And so it's, one of the difficulties with the poem is it's really, there's no real focus on, I'm not sure what I'm trying to accomplish here. I just had some images. And some poetry, some postmodern poetry. I was reading a book of postmodern poetry this spring and summer, and all I could think of was some of the poets, they're just doing images because images are nice. And they're random images, and I have no idea what the poems are about. And when I teach modern poetry the next time, those poems are not going in it. And the other poem here, this early poem, was written, I kind of hesitate sharing this one because this was written my first semester of teaching, my second year of grad school, 30 years ago. And this was kind of illustrating the imagery, it illustrates my frustration and angst about struggling to figure out how to grade essays. And it was autumn and the leaves were falling, and so were the essays. My first year of teaching, I tell people when they're starting, students of mine, when they're starting out student teaching, I always tell them, whenever you start teaching, if you think it's really bad, just keep in mind, you're struggling and all that, just keep in mind, you know somebody who's teaching, first year of teaching was absolute hell for the students and for himself, and he's learned a lot since. And so, always keep that in mind, that you're not going to ever walk into a situation where your first class of students are sitting there staring at each other. They're there 15 minutes before the first day of start of the first class. They're staring at each other and nobody's talking. And you can't get them to talk most of the semester. So anyway, fallen from glory. Raging embers fall one, to the brown grass outside my window. I look up from a half-graded essay and watch the dropping colors. the golden blood-red shadows as they fall, one. I look back at the paper, black on white in regular characters, my weaving line and scratching, the only lifeblood on the leaves. The afternoon wind whispers across the vacant field, driving the colors into the fence where they cling. I turn a page, driving my red against an awkward wall of diction. Leaves and words. By evening, the wind and I each cease our labor. This, by the way, was published in the literary magazine at Baylor. It was the last poem of the spring 1988 issue. And I had a couple of my grad school professors come up to me and wonder if I was okay. I'd only written the poem like 6 months before, so it was like I'd come to terms with.
Well, it sounds like you survived. Here you are 26 years later, or more actually. So a central part of your pilgrimage has been shaped by your belief in God and your understanding of the role of the church. In fact, as I was going through your collection, the first one in your Poems of Growth or Development, the Old Church, and the other one that caught my eye was the year our voices broke. And there you obviously are making reference to the experience in the church. I wonder if you could talk a bit about how your poetry intersects with your life as a child of God.
That's a good question. I think part of it is because many of the things that I have been inspired by, some of them are Christian poets, but I've had times when I've been writing and writing poems and realizing I'm repeating things like the Psalms do. And because I do read a lot of the Psalms, and as my students know from starting classes with them a lot of times, I'm conscious of a lot of hymns. I attend a church where we have a lot of, especially 19th and early 20th century hymns, the better ones. And so I think that's part of it. Part of it also is that I found that sometimes it may be easier to attempt in a poem to express what I'm thinking and believing in about God than it is in a prose work, partly because with a poem, you're using images, you're using a picture, you're not trying to be as consciously word-centered, even though you're using words, but you're using words almost like a painter uses oil or watercolor, or a musician, a pianist is using the keys on the piano. And because sometimes the most consciously faith-oriented things that I've written are not necessarily things where I'm deliberately, willfully, intentionally, no, this story or this poem has nothing consciously to do with, that I look at it and go, oh, maybe, there's maybe a little point there. But yeah. And in the Poems of Growth, I include the first one because I had to conclude something from the poems I was writing between like 1989 and about 1994 or 5. When I was finished with my master's degree in 1989, the last month of my degree study, it was 1 month of intensive. I got up in the morning, ate breakfast, started studying for my master's oral exam. And it was a stack, literally at one point I stacked, it was almost as tall as I was, of books containing poetry, novels, secondary materials that I had to know before I walked into a room with a bunch of professors who were going to ask me every question, and whether I got my degree depended on how I was able to answer them. But when you read so intensively poetry across the spectrum, in particular, it has an effect. And I came back from a couple of weeks of break and to take my first grad school class, the second half of the summer session, and I just couldn't stop writing poetry. And poetry different than I had written before. More focused, more serious. And because I was living in Texas, and I was, after 3 years of hearing how bad New York was and how great Texas was, I was like, okay, I have to start, it started me thinking about, what about New York do I love? And first thing I started thinking about were the Adirondacks. Because I spent a lot of time, from the time I was 3.5 when I was dragged up my first mountain, and 5 when I first climbed my first Adirondack high peak, and finished the Adirondack 46 at 13. And, you know, I mean, I hiked and hiked and hiked, and so all that imagery came back. And I started collecting some resources, because a lot of older books were starting to be reprinted in that time period. So I started collecting a whole bunch of books on the Adirondacks, and down in Texas I was reading them, and I started writing poems. And this first one is kind of the theme poem of the collection, Ghost Houses, because I was thinking of ghosts in the past, not just the ghosts of my own past, but ghosts of people who'd gone before. Some of the poems were about famous figures, people that I had read about or heard about, who were, you know, these characters who populated the Adirondack Mountains. And this one was written actually before I went back and visited the place I'm writing about. If I had written it later, I would have not had a church in it, because there wasn't a church. I didn't know that at the time. I thought there was. And this was before Google Earth, so I couldn't go look at it. But there was a village right near the trailhead in the southern part of the High Peaks region in the Adirondacks. There's a village that was abandoned in the 1950s. Miners lived there. And when I was a kid, the houses were all still there. Most of them are still there. They have trees growing. The trees that were little saplings when I was a kid are now big towering things. But I think they've started trying to restore or preserve these houses, because they weren't being maintained at the time. So this was a poem which I looked at 3 different glimpses of the village that I was later went back and visited. And the last part is an attempt to express some kind of spiritual life or Christian life. I'm not sure the image works. It probably doesn't, but it was an attempt. So, ghost houses. 1, the old church. Sitting in 2s or 3s in neatly pressed rows of wooden benches, they waited, I wait, in expectation of blessing. Sunlight filters softly through colored shapes, staining faces with speckled light. We breathe in words and sounds and cloaked glory. Inside the wind-worn clapboard ghost house, which stands still in a village long inhabited by similar shells of paint-chipped plywood. 2, the abandoned house. Cracked dishes lie neatly stacked on the cupboard shelf, as if the mother had toiled once more at the suds before she joined her family in the Model T. Outside in the grass, a rusted fire wagon lies on its impenetrable side, once red, once whirring under a child's touch. Shards of glass scatter about my feet as I step to the partially boarded window, hoping for a sharper vision of past ghosts. 3, the overgrown clearing. I walk through the waist-high grass, scaring gardener snakes sunning themselves on flat stretches of exposed rock. But I wasn't startled, seeing them slither. They're only empty passages, swallowing holes, prey small enough to bury alive. I too am a hollow predator, devouring in part until I too am swallowed, though fearfully, becoming myself once empty, a ghost house. And of course the idea there I was trying to get at was that God was devouring the same way I was devouring, and devouring the things of God, and so on, but it needed to be developed much more, and so on. Now the villanelle that I included, the year our voices broke, and it was the other person here, it speaks with the speaker and his friend. The friend at the time, it was somebody I knew kind of, because I corresponded with this one singer who was a very successful choir boy who had a hit record in England in the 1990s. So he and I didn't know each other when we were kids, but it was, he had stopped any kind of singing. And it was kind of my reaction to that. When I was young, I didn't sing much until I was in 5th grade, and then our music teacher talked me into joining the choir. We were doing the Wizard of Oz songs, and she wanted me to sing. And she started where she thought more my speaking voice was, and I was singing somewhere else. And so she kept moving up the key, and finally realized I was way up there in the sopranos. And so that's what kind of started. And the title was inspired by an Australian film, and I don't remember the name of the director, but Noah Taylor was the actor in that film. And that was where I got the idea of the title. The first line, this was the first villanelle I wrote for advanced poetry class, and the first line was something I came up with in a poem I was trying to write in 1982. And this was 21 years later, and I had to write the villanelle, and I'm like, what can I do? And that line came back to me, and I was like, okay, let's see where this goes. So that was kind of what started this, and once I had the first line and the third line, the rest of it I just went with. The year our voices broke. Sing me that sweet song you sang long ago when you and I were young, and you could sing in a voice pure as only angels know. Once I too scaled heights where few voices go, Sundays in the choir I would keep trying. Sing me that sweet song you sang long ago, when in front you faced the nave, sang solo, the Pie Jesu, the Sanctus, ringing in a voice pure as only angels know. But once your voice broke, from the spotlight's glow you stepped, choosing silence over changing. Sing me that sweet song you sang long ago, even if you sing several octaves low, for it is not our fate always to sing in a voice pure as only angels know. God finds glory in whatever we sow, if we believe him, the source of singing. Sing me that sweet song you sang long ago, in your voice pure as only angels know. So that's the faith part of the you want me to talk about the other growth poem, or?
I'm going to ask you a question regarding the photography. You have
Okay.
a number of photographs that we've included in this collection, and if you've looked at Dr. Beach's door at any time, you usually will find at least some presented there and at other times. And obviously, you're a creative artist that extends beyond poetry. You've written numerous short stories. I don't know if you have a novel completed yet.
I have like 3 novels completed, but I've never tried to get one published because I get to a certain point and I realize editors. And I'm like, okay, editors and agents, the plague. So
you're holding those.
Yeah, they're sitting and I've shared them with friends, and I've gotten some really good constructive feedback, but I've fixed them and they're still sitting there.
So stay tuned. But in the meantime, you've clearly taken an interest in photography, and both relative to your travels and not necessarily just in your travels. You want to talk a little bit about where poetry fits into, maybe how it's even influenced some of your thoughts about creative expression, maybe specifically in poetry, but more generally.
Well, whenever I travel, I always take pictures because I know when I go somewhere, I can't fully experience it. No matter how long I stand there and stare at the church, look around this beautiful church, and I need more time to think about it than I can, if I could spend a week or a month at every place I go to visit, it would be really good, and then I wouldn't bother taking pictures as much. But I find that if I take pictures, especially of churches and old buildings and places, things that look interesting at the moment, I find if I take the pictures, then when I'm ready to write the poem about it, about my poems for my trip, I then have all this data, and I don't have to go on Google and search images and try to find, because there are some places I've been and some churches I've taken pictures of that aren't on the internet. Believe it or not, there actually are things that are not on the internet. But what I find is I do enough getting of the detail that when I'm writing a poem about a church, I can remember exactly what is on this side of the church versus what's on that side, because I took pictures of what's on this side of the church and what's on that side. And so a lot of my pictures I try to do as aesthetically pleasing as possible, but sometimes it just doesn't work out. And what I'm trying to do is simply just, take the photograph because you'll notice in the booklet there, the one of the church toward the very back. I would really like to have had and it's a little darker here than in the original, I would really like to have been able to capture that end of the church. If it had been stained glass behind the altar, it would have had a better chance, but it was all clear glass. And the clear glass let in so much light that it darkened, so you really can't tell that the pillars are a bright orange. And it was something I didn't wind up putting in the poem because I couldn't figure out how to make relevant the fact that they were bright orange pillars. Beautiful, but bright orange. And that's something I discovered a lot in my travels, is that churches are quite often colors we would not expect. We very sober and solemn Americans would not decorate our churches. I mean, I have seen more pink churches than I can possibly imagine. And I think they were originally supposed to be red, but if you know what happens to red when it's out in the sun too much, it lightens. And so red stone becomes pink stone, and red paint becomes pink paint. And you can guess, as a guy, I'm not a fan of pink. So, but photographs, and quite often, things that I took photos of that I didn't expect. I wanted writing a poem once about Barth. Right? I don't even know if they say Barth or Bart there, but I wanted writing a poem because I'd taken pictures there. And I was there only because I was on my way looking to get to the beach along the Baltic Sea. And that happened to be, I drove through that town because I had read Karl Barth theology when I was in grad school, and I was, if I'm going to be in this area, I'm going to go through this town that his family might have been named for. Anyway, it was just kind of random. It was a nice town to walk around. And then I did finally, but I had to drive another 40 kilometers before I found a beach that wasn't owned by a hotel and wouldn't let us, wouldn't let visitors who weren't staying there walk across. But
it's interesting what you're describing, very much in the traditional artist's approach of sketching a piece before he or she would then paint the painting. So in essence, you have the modern equivalent of taking a photograph, or maybe many photographs, both as a reminder, but then also an opportunity to explore and study it in a way that one can't if you're about 6,000 or 8,000 miles away. And certainly the idea that your own photograph potentially captures your view rather than taking a stock photo online and taking someone else's perspective or what they pay attention to.
occasionally I've had to use, when either my photos haven't come out or when I didn't get to a place and I want to reference it in a poem, I will use things online. But I find that it's, actually all of the more recent poems that I've included are all ones I was realizing, at least in part, I was looking at my own photos when I was working on preparing the poems, drafting them. Or if I wasn't looking at them directly, they were in my mind. And so some of the things that I reference in the poems are things that were in those photos and might not have been there on another day if somebody else was taking pictures.
Well, you've mentioned some of your travels, and you have traveled extensively, especially in the last number of years, primarily in Europe. And I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about how your travel has shaped your sense of the poetic, how you obviously talked about the relationship to the photographs, but how has that changed maybe the way you see the world? And
well, before I was, what happened was when I turned 50, my family decided that they were going to send me to Europe for 4 weeks with a rental car. And that started, I then did another trip for about 10 days in 2016, and my brother and I went to Stockholm in this past May, and he's now trying to figure out another trip for us this spring after the semester's over. But before that, I had been writing, I had a whole series of poems I was writing about movies, the spiritual journey of characters in movies. I also was writing a lot of more formal poetry on the Arthurian legend. I did the only other poetry reading I've ever done here was that was my name on the poster, was one that I was doing those Arthurian poems. And that was the first time I was really seriously trying to do traditional stanzas, traditional meters, even rhyme, which is like alien to me. And so I took a lot of those kinds of experiences, and when I went to Europe, all of a sudden I'm in places that I've read about, but never seen in person. And it was like, wow. And I was traveling in a place where, yes, some people speak English. Most hotels in Europe, somebody there will speak English. But I did have two where my knowledge of German was very useful because they didn't speak any English there. If you go off the beaten path of the tourists, there are some places where you will find very little English. And what it did was, when I was observing people, especially the 4 weeks that I spent mostly in Germany, but I got to 12 different countries in that trip. But sometimes just sitting and listening. I drove into the Czech Republic. I didn't have time to go to Prague, which I really wanted to go to. I didn't have time in the trip to go there. But I went into a little town called Czech. The German name for it is Eger, or something like that. And I just went in there and I sat for about a half an hour listening to people walk by, because I wanted to hear what Czech sounded like. Because there's something about listening, even if you don't know what the language sounds, what the language people are saying, there's a certain pattern, certain patterns that show up in languages, and there's a certain beauty to the music of the language. And I love to listen, even when I don't know what somebody's saying, I love to listen, hear the language. And there's some languages like German I've worked at trying to learn. There's some languages like Czech I haven't, but I like the sound of it. And there's some languages like Swedish, which I was encountering this year, where I realized I am never going to be able to pronounce this language. There is something about the way that they spell things, I just can't. I'm stuck. I'd have to live there for quite a while, and even then I probably wouldn't be able to. And of course the problem was, after I had been speaking so much German in my previous trips, I was in Sweden, and every time somebody would start speaking Swedish to me, my instinctive reaction was to try to speak German to them. And that isn't going to work. They know English in Sweden, especially in Stockholm. In fact, their English is probably better sometimes than mine. But what it did was it gave me also perspective on seeing a part of the world which is very developed, very orderly, very organized, which is different than ours. And there are a lot of their expectations, there were things I really loved there. I mean, you can bicycle or walk between every town on the continent without ever having to be on the shoulder of a road. They have bike trails and footpaths everywhere. If you look at a map of the Wanderweg in Switzerland, which is the wander path, basically, the hiking trails, it looks like the mesh of a screen door. Every village in Switzerland is on it. And sometimes the village is where the paths cross. You could go all the way across Switzerland without ever once getting into a car if you wanted to hike. I wish I were younger, I'd do it.
You want to go ahead and read some of the poems?
The first one here is actually one that's still somewhat in process. What I've done is, in putting my poems from Europe together, I've been creating, the first one was The Emotional Tourist. I'm trying to create poems where the speaker is not necessarily me, even though he is speaking about things I've seen, but the emotional tourist is someone who lives vicariously through the experiences of others around him. Basically, someone who doesn't know what's going on, but he's kind of living off, This was an idea I got from Steve Scott, who's a poet, spoken word poet and a singer-songwriter. Actually, just came out this week with a new album. And he got it from David Bowie, so I guess it's a good idea. The spiritual tourist, somebody who goes and visits a lot of churches. The casual tourist, someone who goes expecting just to go on a vacation and starts discovering things he wasn't expecting. Well, this first poem is from the fourth collection I'm working on, called The Accidental Tourist. someone who keeps running into things that he is not at all, he's surprised and he's shocked, and so on. And this first one is inspired by a poem by Charles Olson, who is one of the postmodern poets I was reading this spring and summer. This is something I saw this when on my trip in 2013, but I was writing it this year. The title of Charles Olson's poem is The Lordly and Isolate Satyrs. So, and his poem is about some young man in, I think it was New Orleans. But I was reading this poem, and while I was sitting, waiting for my car to be done, and so I started immediately scratching ideas for this poem, and and I wound up becoming. Brandenburg Gate is a prominent landmark. It's next to the Reichstag, which is the national legislature in Berlin, and it was on the East Berlin side of the Berlin Wall, within sight of all the people in West Berlin, which was part of Free West Germany. And between I don't remember when the wall was built, but it was basically, Berlin was divided after the war in 1945. It was not until the wall came down in 1989 that West Berliners actually got to the Brandenburg Gate. And and so on. And so it's a big landmark, and there are lots of tourists and lots of people dressed up you could take pictures with. And then there are these young men hanging out in the shadows. The satyrs of Brandenburg Gate. In the shadows of Brandenburg Gate I see them, the lordly and isolate satyrs, standing stiff in their conforming poses, alone in their flock, their hair spiked in nightshades or the colors of a neon rainbow as mood strikes them. Cigarettes dangle from pierced lips, gauges spread some lobes to discs rivaling those of an African queen. These boys, like leather and denim ravens, watch the passing girls like so much potential carrion, and they hunger, they thirst for what's beyond reach. Where once a wall divided west from east, freedom from bondage, a cobblestone line marks the city's scar. Between the whispering teens and their unknowing prey, an equally abrupt barrier stands firm. Though invisible, this wall between shadow and passing light cannot be traversed by the posing satyrs without some carnage, or so they think. The girls remain heedless of danger. Staying in shadow, desiring the girls, their colors, their flesh, their cheerful vitality, the boys indistinct from the columned landmark past that looms overhead. They blend into the landscape unlike faux Russian soldiers, Schwarzenegger's Predator, and Super Mario Brothers, each of whom charge gullible strangers €5 in posing for photos framed by the heroic memorial in the background. One of the raven-haired boys stubs a cigarette on pavement, steps forward as if to speak something to a girl, perhaps something he sees at school, but his fellow satyrs laugh at a joke. He turns back to catch the punchline, and his prey continues her way, unaware of his interest, his hunger. Once the laughter dissipates, he looks for her face among the swirling crowds, but his chance has vanished. At once predator and prey, each boy thinks only of what he desires and not of consequence. The raven beak of thoughtless hunger ravages, devours the satyr, seeking gratification. And the idea I had there was that those who seek to devour are themselves also devouring themselves. It's a destructive pattern. And so I have no idea whether that was actually what was going on in their minds, but when you're writing poems about people you observe, you get to tell the story. One of my first poems, after my first trip in 2013, I wrote about this couple I saw at a hotel the first morning on my trip. Well, it's actually the second morning on the trip. The first real, day of the journey was about to begin, and I was in East Frankfurt, and this businessman and his assistant, something like administrator, I don't know what the situation was, but it was just this very weird, awkward chemistry or lack thereof between the two of them, the man and the woman, and so that became the poem. And it was kind of an interesting, because I wound up thinking about that one for several days after unfortunately I did get a picture of them. It was probably a good idea, I didn't. You don't normally carry the camera and take pictures of people while they're sitting near you in the hotel restaurant eating breakfast. The other three poems from the more recent ones are Two of them are from the spiritual, actually one of them is from the spiritual tours, and the other two are from the casual tours. They're all from Alsfeld. Alsfeld is the nearest big town to the little village, Tenrod, where my great-great-grandmother, Christina Louisa Yeckel, emigrated in 1854 to come to America. I wanted to write a poem about her and her family, and I had a whole poem drafted, and it was a really nice poem about her father lived in Loisel, and her mother lived 2 kilometers away across the fields in Tenrod, and it was a beautiful love story. And then I discovered that Christina was born in, I knew she was born in August of 1838, and I then discovered her parents were married in July of 1839. And then I decided, well, I guess I'm not going to write that poem. It's not going to be the kind of poem that, it probably wasn't, it was too idealistic and so on. Still have not figured out why all of that happened. But the church in the center of the Altstadt, the old city, in the old part of the city in Alsfeld, is Walpurgiskirche, St. Walpurga's church. Walpurga was a medieval nun, abbess, something like that. But she was somebody that there are a number of churches named after her and so on. And so this is based on my visit on the Sunday morning. I would have gone to church in Loisel, there's a church there, but unfortunately they don't actually have services except once a month, and I wasn't there on that once a month. I was there the week after Pentecost, and they had the service on Pentecost. Worship silence under the arched canopy as we visitors wander open-eyed, and sometimes snap covert photos, hoping not to disturb any who still pray. Though we are in a Protestant church in iconoclastic Hesse, art's displayed everywhere. Medieval saints on the east wall smile benignly across the sanctuary, where stern faces of Reformation heroes stare back. Luther and Melanchthon wonder why Jesus stands with the saints, not on their side, despite their many holy words. But Christ just smiles and holds up the world. Around the barren altar, this church has no pastor, no communion. Biblical scenes hang on balcony rail and lower wall. Adam and Eve tempted, cast out of the garden. Abram raising the knife above his Isaac. Jacob dreaming of angels. Jesus crucified, a bright golden sun overpowering the cross. Jesus dead, being gently carried away. Beside a weathered stone font, I speak with a German couple of life and faith. And originally this poem was going to go on and on and on and on, and I realized that I'd stopped this point in the draft when I was working on it, the first time I was working on it. I went back to it and I was like, what do I say next? And I realized, I don't say anything next. You stop when I had a professor in grad school who, one thing I noticed about all of his poems was they always had a perfect ending point, and then he continued for 2 or 3 times the length. And I never understood that, because he had 2 or 3 poems that really should have been 2 or 3 poems that were just straightened into one. What I did here was, and this is one of the things I've been doing more recently, is when I'm writing a poem, however I wind up writing the poem, is the form kind of dictates itself as I go. The Satyrs of Brandenburg Gate was, I think that was a blank verse poem I encountered. This one wound up being 9-syllable lines. I don't know why, that's how it happened. The poem that's on my office door right now about the storks of Oberhickstedt, that wound up being 7-syllable lines simply because the title was 7-syllable line, so I decided it made sense that every other line had to be 7 syllables. And so these are 9-syllable lines, 3-line stanzas. They're 9 stanzas of 3 lines each of 9 syllables. I probably was reading Dante too much, because this is a Dantean kind of thing with 3s and 9s and so on. But because I spent some time in Alsfeld, I was there for basically from dinner time until about lunchtime the next day, in and around Alsfeld. I wanted writing a couple poems, and so I decided to include a couple so I didn't have to describe a lot of extra things. This one is Aliens in Alsfeld. The structure is kind of irregular lines. It's sort of free verse. I broke up indented the lines. I've been reading a lot of some of the postmodern poets, including Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who was born in 1919 and is still alive. I just checked. He's still alive. He wrote Coney Island of the Mind, and he's one of the ones in the last few years who's really influenced a lot of my approach to not just how to structure a poem, but also the phrasing and so on. And this is one of the things I noticed on my trip in 2016 was how much the migration of people from the Middle East had changed the landscape. Because everywhere I went in 2016, I saw women dressed in the hijab. I had seen almost none. I'd seen a few, but very few, like in Berlin in 2013, but not in 2016. Everywhere I went. And so this was kind of my way of kind of encapsulating a moment, and the whole idea of being alien, because of course I was an alien. German is my second language, and barely that, compared to the people. I love the fact that we have so many students here who English is like their second or fifth language, and their English is so much better than my German, and I've been studying German since the fall of '74. And I'm never going to be as good at German as many of my students have been with English. So anyway, aliens in Allsveld. Outside St. Walburga's church, I stand in gathering shadows, snapping pictures of sacred architecture. A waitress clears tables at a nearby cafe as glasses clink in a beer hall decorated with coats of arms of famous medieval citizens. Above me, granite buttresses rise, supporting the burden of holiness within. In the nearby square, costumed actors enact historic moments of Allsveld past to entertain a tour group who fail to see the sightseer in the shadows. Then, across the cobblestones, two women walk quickly, while the actors and tourists pause to watch the alien sight of faces emerging dark-toned from under hijab. The women, aware of the staring eyes, hurry past and soon vanish around the corner, out of sight. The actors then resume their play. The waitress cleans another table, and I, the true stranger here, remain unnoticed, unobserved, as the darkness falls. And the third of the Allsveld poems, one of the places I visited in my trip in 2016 was I visited a lot of cemeteries, because I'm doing family research and trying to figure out where some of my ancestors came from, and are there any people of that same name still around? And I was in the Allsveld Cemetery, and I discovered a separate part, the Jewish cemetery, which was behind a wall. And so there was a sign at the gate that you can't go on Saturday, but this was a Sunday afternoon, so I went in. And so when I was writing this poem, I was looking at the photos. So I make reference to, this is my attempt to some of these lines in here are my attempt to translate the German rendering, not the Hebrew rendering, but the German rendering on some of the gravestones. Allsveld Jewish Cemetery. Patches of sunlight and shadow model the grassy space beneath oaks and spruces. Uncut lawn broken by vertical stones, declaring the names and dates of the dead in Hebrew and Roman letters. Jewish citizens of nearby Allsveld here bury their parents and grandparents, their husbands and wives, once or twice a child. Here rests our good mother, Adelheide's sons proclaimed on her stone. Adel's praised for his faithful duty to his home and his town. Elise for being her husband's true wealth, her children's happiness and grace. Bertha's life comprised of goodness and love. David and Caroline were dear parents. Patriot Emil served in the army, and he died in the First World War in France. Dr. Daniel Strauss, dead at 25, was his parents' unforgettable son. With him, their pride, their hope, their joy of life sank into the cold, barren grave. The letters on some stones have faded, worn by decades of sun, wind, rain, and neglect. Small flowers lift their heads, searching for sun. No birds sing. My footsteps, the only sound as I walk among the graves, their Their stories only partly visible now. The last dead interred here in 1938, except for memorials erected for Jeanette, murdered in Zemash, and for Sally and Suzanne in Theresienstadt. Wallach and Rothschild, Flürsheim and Speyer, Stein and Lorsch, Steinberger and Fuld. These names repeated within this burial space, stained under crosses on the stones outside the wall, in the shaded, grassy Allsfeld Cemetery. A quiet reminder that those who were sent to the gas chambers and crematoria, and those who set them, often shared the same family names. And that was something I discovered on my trip in 2016, was seeing that the same family names were on the memorials of those who had been sent to because almost every town now that had Jewish citizens who were sent to the concentration camps have a memorial. And the same family names are on this memorial as are on the war memorial for those who fought in the war and those who were buried in the cemetery. And that was something that was a shock to me. Because you think of, people talk about there's a difference in, culture and so on. Really, they were the same. And that has got me thinking a lot about what's going on in the world today. And quite often, the people who are persecuted, who are hated, are not that much different. In fact, sometimes they're more alike than the people who are doing the hating understand. Anyway, that's kind of
Thank you. At this point, I'd like to open up to the floor. If there's an individual who has a question that you'd like to ask Dr. Beach.
By the way, the one poem I didn't read was the one poem that I was used as an example of. I've written a lot of poems about relationships using different kinds of John Donne-like imagery, and I've also done a lot with dramatic monologue. And there is no one I had in mind with Insolvent Mind. I was not writing about anybody in particular. I just was writing about the whole idea of bankruptcy. Because I wrote it during the Great Recession, when we're talking about foreclosures and bankruptcy and all of that. And I was thinking about that imagery in terms of relationships. So anyway, I want to say that. So, but anyway, any questions?
I guess that means I've done a fairly good job, but well then, let me just draw your attention. Well, first of all, let's give Dr. Beach a round of applause. I am very appreciative to him for his willingness to present his poetry. It takes a certain act of the heart and mind to, in one sense, expose yourself to put yourself out there, and I appreciate that, your willingness to do it. I just want to draw your attention finally to the information about the fine print as one of the supporters of this evening. Remind you, as poets and writers aspiring to express yourself in powerful ways, in meaningful ways, and to share that with the Nyack community, and who knows, but beyond. And someday, I won't be here to moderate it, but maybe some of you will be seated up here. But anyway, encourage you to see the instructions there regarding the fine print submission. The date is a long way away. It's February. It seems like years and years away, but before you know it, it'll be February.
And they do look forward also to art and photographs.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And I mean, one of the things I love about the fine print is there are so many good photographs. We have so many talented people more talented than I am.
So that's the last word. Listen, thank you again for joining us this evening. And at this point, we're going to conclude. And there are some goodies back there, which Rachel, if you wouldn't mind just uncovering. Then feel free to speak with Dr. Beach if you have any individual questions you'd like to ask him, either about a particular poem or possibly his ideas on certain subjects or thoughts. Feel free to do that. Otherwise, certainly enjoy a little snack on your way out for studying and whatever else you have.